All right, well, I think we should get going. We have Dr. Melissa Cast-Brede from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, here to talk this morning about the wild world of copyright.
Yes. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm glad. Thanks for those of you who showed up, because I do hope that this is a conversation between us about copyright, at least some give and take, because a big part of figuring out what's okay is having to reasoning through, okay, what are we doing here? What are our options and all those things? And I personally find it easier to reason those things out loud with somebody else to bounce ideas off of. So Denise, you asked about story time and that question that you're getting a lot of. So within this presentation, I actually picked story time as our example to go through. So we can talk about that and see what those options are. You'll see in a minute why I chose a wild world of nature theme here with the top as we get into some foundational things. But I don't know about what everyone here feels about copyright. But I remember the first time I started realizing it was going to be a part of my career as a librarian was in a reference class. I'm sitting in this reference class and I hear about it. And there was two things in that class I swore I was not going to be the librarian that dealt with. One was plagiarism and one was copyright. And here I am 30 some years later, every semester and every couple times a year, here I am. So it's just something we can't avoid. That being said, let's see here. I advance my screen. There we go. I should say I am not a lawyer. I cannot provide legal assistance or advice. And I will tell you every presentation I've attended, every webinar that has been led by a lawyer about copyright, even they say, I can't give you legal advice. So it's really important statement to say, because you yourselves cannot give it for your patrons. Because there are times we see our patrons doing things or wanting to do things and you're kind of like, oh, wait a minute. But just a reminder, none of us are lawyers. We can talk through things, and that's what we'll do today, is talk through fair use, because fair use is usually how we can do things. But we can't actually give advice. We can just help people reason through things, and which is what we do in a lot of times, isn't it? We help them reason through whatever their information need is or what they're looking for. I know usually people give their resources at the end, but I've started doing it at the beginning, especially some key ones. And a lot of this talk is based on Carrie Russell, who is a copyright expert with the American Library Association and has written a lot of it. And specifically because of this storytime question being very prevalent right now, two of these are about that very thing and her interpretation of copyright, fair use, and storytime. And so a lot of what I'm basing this on is based on her work. I also find Stanford Library's website on copyright. If you really want to dig in and dig deep on it and answer some tough questions, I find it very helpful. It gives a lot of cases that you can then relate back to your own situation. But first, to make sure we're kind of all on the same page, I'm going to do some foundational concepts, and then we'll walk through this idea of fair use and story time. If we have time, depending on our conversation, we'll also just make sure we're all aware of some unique library situations related to copyright, and then just answer any questions at the end. That's my plan. So first, I personally find it useful to remind folks that copyright is our right. It's in the Constitution. So we have had this law, this right, since 1787, the beginning of our country, right? We have had copyright because our forefathers realized for us to grow as a country, people needed to have ideas and they needed to benefit from those ideas in order to keep doing it. So there was some incentive to invent things and to develop new ideas. So that's in the Constitution right there at the very beginning. So people have the right authors, inventors have the rights to their stuff for a limited time. So what that means is if you've created something, you get to decide who makes copies, who makes derivatives off of these. So like if you have a book, an audio recording would be a derivative. Distribute copies, who gets to perform the work, display the work, perform it electronically. You get to decide all those things. Well, then who exactly owns copyright? And this is why I have my wild world of copyright theme is Naruto here. I believe she's a lady, lovely Naruto. There was a court case based around her. So before I go into the court case, if I look at this group here, how many of us here today own a copyright?
Well, none of us think we do. No.
Okay, I would question that. I think you probably all own a copyright. And let me tell you why. I'll tell you that through the story of Naruto. So I'm not even sure where she lives. In a refuge, a wildlife refuge or something like that. There was a photographer out there and he's taking pictures. He leaves his camera to go off and do something. And while he's gone, Naruto picks up the camera and takes a selfie like any person would, right? So the photographer then decides it's a great photo. So he starts selling it. And an animal rights group says, no, wait a minute. You didn't take that picture. You don't own it. Just because it's your camera and stuff, you don't own it. They made this claim because copyright law says copyright occurs when the expression of an idea takes a tangible form. So is anyone here taking a picture? You own copyright of that picture. If you've written a letter, that's your ideas taking a tangible form. That's protected by copyright. Anytime an expression of an idea takes a tangible form. So if you're doodling right now, a picture of me with devil horns or something, that's protected by copyright. So all of that immediately does that. So we all have copyright. It occurs everywhere throughout our lives. And so we should be aware of that we own it as well. It's not just something we're fighting against. It's something we have ourselves. There's also something that's called the first sale doctrine. And this is how a lot of libraries, this is what allows us to do a lot of what we do. The first sale doctrine says if we buy a copy of a copyrighted work, a book, a map, a physical copy of it, then we can sell that, we can display that, we can dispose of that, we can loan it, we can do what we want with that physical copy. So that's what lets us do a lot of things. That's with the story walks, story walks where people do different pages of a book and people can walk along outside to see the whole book and then we have questions with it and such. With the story walk, we can't scan or photocopy those pages and put them on there, but we can buy 2 copies of that book, take that book apart and display it in a story walk because of first sale doctrine. That lets us do that. It lets us put books on display in our library because we can do what we want with that copy. Now, it does not mean we can make copies of that copy. It does not mean we can distribute copies we have made of that copy. It also does not cover any licensing that we may have. So like software, it has that shrink wrap license, that plastic wrap, that if you unwrap it, you are accepting the license agreement that's like some in tiny, tiny print, most likely on this thing, right? That means we've accepted that. So it doesn't cover those things. If we've opened it or whatever, it doesn't cover that. Any rentals, ebooks are not owned They're licensed, right? So it doesn't cover those things. First sale really is limited to physical items. Okay, so now we're getting into the fair use, which is really what helps us a lot. Some people, I've heard it referred to as a defense, like if you've done something without asking permission and the copyright owner comes after you, they say this is how you defend yourself. But most people's legal folks say, no, really, this is options in the law that says there are times when you're using something, it's okay for you to do it without asking permission because it's just fair. It's just fair. So it allows you to use intellectual property, something somebody else created, under certain conditions. So those certain conditions, I'm skipping ahead here, sorry, I forgot. So story time could be one of those certain conditions. To determine that, you have to consider 4 factors. And these are the 4 fair use factors that courts always use to decide if something is fair use in copyright. Is this okay for somebody to use? So we're talking the purpose of the use, like why are you using this work? The nature of the work, how much you're using, and the 4th one is the effect on the market. All 4 things have to be considered. You can't just go to purpose. Oh, our purpose is noble and good. That's awesome. That isn't, you've got to consider all 4 of this and look at all 4 because sometimes one might trump another. You have to consider all 4. And so that's what we want to do today is think about story time in terms of these 4 fair use factors: purpose, nature, amount, and effect on the market. So the first one, purpose of the use. Why are you doing this? So questions to ask: is your use educational or nonprofit? If it is, it leans more towards fair use than if it's commercial, if you're making money. That being said, there are times people have made money and it's been entirely fair use. And there have been times when there's been an educational purpose, a nonprofit use, but it has not been fair use. So just because you're educational and nonprofit isn't a guarantee. And a lot of people think that's it. If it's educational, I got it. No, there's got to be more to it, but it does help you a great deal, right? So that's something to consider. And then the last thing is transformative. Is your use transformative? Meaning, are you using it for a different purpose than what it was originally intended for? So if we're thinking about that purpose and the purpose of the use, one of the things I don't want to like hit you over the head with this, the idea that just because your use is educational or nonprofit means it's okay. This is a case back from 1983 that gets referred to a lot in other court cases. So the courts refer back to this case often about public school teacher, taught home ec, and she put together a booklet for this class. And then there was a section on cake decorating. So she didn't make any money off this. She didn't charge the students. It was within her classroom. But she used 11 pages from a cake decorating book that she got when she took an outside class on cake decorating. But she took 11 pages from that, put them in her booklet for her class. And the cake decorating author sued her and said, no, that's mine. You can't do that without my permission. And the courts agreed with her. The teacher could not do this because their purpose was the same. They were both trying to teach cake decorating. So the purpose was the same. So they weren't allowed to do that. The other thing is that transformative piece. What are you adding to this purpose that changes the nature, not the nature of the work, the character of the work? Or can be what you're doing, make it a substitute for the work. So if it's transformative, meaning criticism, like book reviews, will often take big chunks of the work and include it in there, or the book cover or something. It's because they're critiquing it. So they can do it for purposes of critique. Or maybe you're making commentary on something. Or news reporting, you would have an image of this famous person doing something. Now, the news station probably didn't get that photo. It's just a photo that was released to the press, but they're using it in purposes of news reporting. So it's transformative. Their purpose is different than what it was originally intended. And then there's also parody. Now, with parody, you have to be clearly making fun of something else. And so this is how Saturday Night Live, the old Carol Burnett show, used to get by, in that they were doing a lot of parody. I imagine they both got sued a lot, but the grounds was parody. And so just as an example here of parody, these are two examples that went to court. The New Yorker based their cover on the movie poster for Moscow on the Hudson, and then the movie poster for Naked Gun 33 and the Third or whatever was based on an old Vanity Fair cover. So both situations involved a court case. The New Yorker lost because they really weren't making fun of anything. It wasn't funny. They weren't making fun of anything. Naked Gun 33 and the Third won because it was clearly trying to poke fun at this idea of celebrity and status and that sort of thing. But notice they had to make it, you can only use as much as you need. So parody is transformative if you're, clearly making fun of the original thing. So those are transformative. With that in mind, all those stuff, what is the purpose of story time? So for all of you, why do you do story time? You can put it in the chat if you want, or you can speak up. There's just a few of us here. To entertain? Is that the only purpose? Okay. Inform. What else are we doing? Educating. Are we doing anything else when we're reading to kids? Are we promoting reading? Hoping to instill a love of reading? Are they learning new vocabulary? Okay. So what is the purpose of the book when it was written? These picture books. Are they usually to entertain? So our purpose is, if it's to educate, to inform, to instill a love of reading, to promote reading, to increase reading motivation. Those are slightly different. Those are different purposes, aren't they? And so also, when we're reading those books during story time, do we read from beginning to end, totally no stopping, or is other stuff happening during story time? And if so, what other stuff is happening? It's interactive. Right, so how's it interactive? Okay, take breaks, explain words, act the scene with puppets. You're adding a lot of stuff to it. You're asking questions. You're developing critical thinking, right? You're having conversations about all this stuff. So if we go back to, oops, I lost my cursor here. This idea of transformative. What is added that adds to the purpose or changes the character of the work? So by asking all those questions and making interactive and explaining words and acting things out, and there's probably movement sometimes, right? Are you having a move? Like every time you hear this word, they do this or something, right? There's movement involved. So are we adding all this other stuff to truly transform this reading this story beyond just storytelling? Are you doing more to that? Okay, so it sounds like we are. If we were just reading from beginning to end and that was it, it sounds an awful lot like entertain, but if we're doing all those other things and our purpose is different, that lends itself towards fair use. The second factor is the nature of the work, meaning the work itself. Is it creative or is it fact-based? Not what you're doing, but the book you're using. Trying to think of a book I have close by with pictures, Wonder Woman. So this book here, is it creative or fact-based? This is creative. If it's creative, it's more protected than it is if it's fact-based. So like statistics from a newspaper, the phone numbers in a phone book are fact-based. So phone books, those phone numbers and addresses are not protected by copyright. People have tried and they've lost every time in the courts because they're just facts. So even nonfiction books take some creativity in putting them together. So the more creative they are, the more protection they have. It's published or unpublished. Published has less protections than unpublished. So those letters that you've written that are protected by copyright or my doodles are more protected than a published picture or something like that. And the other thing is the nature of the work. Is it important to an educational objective? So is it important to your educational objective that we talked about in the first purpose? That's the only time we consider the first purpose of it, is it important to our educational use? So in this case, yeah, it's pretty creative, the story time books, aren't they? So that kind of leads away from fair use. Now, we do have that little piece about importance to an educational objective. Like, we think this is important to teach reading motivation, to educate, to inform, to teach vocabulary. There's probably some social skill learning happening in those story times. Okay, so then the third is how much you're using. The less you use, the more protected it is. I mean, the less you use is fair use. If you use the whole thing, that rules against fair use. You ever just do part of a story in story time? Not very often. So you're using the whole work. So that leads away from fair use. But are you also using the amount you need for an educational objective? Like, you need the whole thing for your objective, don't you? So that there's some tension there against it and for it. And so there's that consideration. Now, there's that word on the left that says unsubstantial amount. So the fair use factor says the amount or substance of the use, the substantialness of the use. So the substantialness, you could be using the whole thing. Like right now, I'm showing the whole page. And this is being recorded, right? So it's the whole thing, the whole page, 2 pages. How substantial is that? I mean, can you make that out? How's the resolution if you tried to make this big and snip it in there? it's actually pretty unsubstantial because of it. So if you're doing story time on a camera, and like, how much of this can they actually see and make out? Will it substitute for the original? Probably not. So that's something to consider. Is this really substantial? Now, did you scan it and display the whole page? That is kind of substantial. So something to think about in terms of that use. So when you're doing story time, you've got the whole book. And if you're doing it over Facebook or YouTube or however you're sharing this, are you showing the whole page? Or is it you holding the book up and talking about what's in the pictures and stuff?
Yeah, that's a distinction that I hadn't thought about, that if you scan the picture and that's the whole screen,
Mm-hmm.
then that's the book itself. That's a derivative, right?
Right. Right. So
Yeah, I had not
the
thought of that.
derivative, like if you use the full screen, that's like a derivative there. Now, if you use just a part of it, is it fair use? And so this is an example of a commercial use that was ruled fair use. The left is a Louis Vuitton bag. And he discovered that this company called My Other Bag was creating canvas totes with this image on it. And he was not happy and sued for copyright. He lost because the court said, one, this was parody. The purpose of the Louis Vuitton bag is, status symbols, show yourself as fashionable or stylish or whatever. You certainly don't use that canvas tote bag to show yourself as stylish or fashionable or, whatever. But notice the picture is similar, but it's not exactly the same. So it's not a totally substantial copy. The colors may be similar. Notice the initials in there are different. The shapes that are used are slightly different. The handles on the bag and the amount of leather at the top there, it's enough for you to get that they're referring to a fancy Louis Vuitton bag, but it's not so much, it's not too much, it's not over the top. Like a full page, do you need to scan that and show that full page? Can you do this in story time like this? Now, a graphic novel is probably not a great example for this, but with a picture book, can you see a whole picture or enough of it? Can you describe it so the children get it? Those are questions to ask. I'm not sharing that makes it better. Just those are things to ask. Can you do this? Because you don't want to be substantial in your use. Because there's a piece of that is also the heart of the work. You're reading the whole story, so you are getting at the heart of it, the most important part of it. You want to make sure that you're not using the whole image, because then you're really using a substantial amount of it. And then the last piece is fair use factor. Are you having an effect on the market? Will people not buy that book because you did it in story time? So I'm assuming you all legally acquired the books you have. Is there a similar product marketed? Do they have a storytime version, the publishers, that they're selling? Were there licensing options available? And are you using it just in a limited fashion? So that means, do you just post it and you forever leave it up there? Is it only live, so you're not recording it, and so you have to be there on time to see it? Or maybe you have it up for the week and take it down when you put up next week's. Or are you limiting it only to your patrons who have registered for it? The more you limit the access to it, I mean, that sounds awful because libraries, we're about access and we're about sharing and stuff like that. So, we kind of cringe and going, what do you mean limit? That's something we need to think about in terms of this. So do you think we're affecting the market for these books? Will someone not buy this book because you did it in story time? Or is there another possibility here? Have you had parents tell you they had to buy the book because the kid loved it so much? So potentially what you're doing is marketing the book and promoting it as well. So when you look at Carrie Russell's, who I've referred to earlier, she talks about that piece of it. That we're not affecting the market. If anything, we're helping the market by sharing it and raising awareness of the book. And kids who really love it will beg their parents to buy a copy, or parents will buy a copy because of this. And because we're doing all that other stuff around it, we're asking questions, we're doing this and we're doing that, it's not an actual direct substitute for the original. If, all they're seeing is this, isn't really a substitute for the original work. I would say the more you, like I said, limit it, as long as you don't keep it up there forever, the more likely it falls in fair use than if you record this and it's up there forever. That has less fair use effect on the market. So if we think about all these 4 factors, purpose, we have a different purpose. We have a different purpose, and we're doing things, adding things to that to make it transformative, to really engage kids in the reading, for that reading promotion. So there's a transformative, it's educational, nonprofit use, but there's also a transformative piece of it. Our purpose is different than the original purpose of it, which is just purely entertainment. We're doing more than just entertainment with it. There's learning happening, and we're doing things to encourage that learning, right? So like I keep showing this book. I've showed this book several times now. In doing that and talking about it and using it as an example to talk about story time, I have a transformative use of this book, of that book cover that you've seen several times now. So it's transformative. Purpose, so that leans towards fair use. It is creative, which is leaning away from it, but it meets the educational purpose that we're trying for in our purpose. We are using the whole thing, but we want to be careful about that substantiality of the images if we're showing them online. So there's that, but we're also, again, we need the whole thing to meet our original purpose. We're not using more than we have to. We're using as much as we need. So do we need to show the full picture as part of that? Or can we get by with just showing part of it on the screen and as we're reading the story and doing that and describing the picture? And then the last one, are we affecting the market? We legally acquired it. We're actually promoting the book. And then there's that last piece of, how available is this video recording? You've done it or not. So the the less availability, like it's only up for a short period of time, or it's only available to your patrons, those things will lend itself more to fair use. Does that make sense? Any questions about that and how we talk through that? Are there examples that you've wondered about that I didn't discuss?
I like that you have a map where you can compare to all and say, is this my purpose? Is that, am I transforming it? I think that will help people tremendously figure out how they can use material appropriately.
And those two articles that Carrie Russell's really, if you need to explain to someone who's asking you that question, are written in a nice, I think, approachable, accessible way to explain how story time fits within fair use. If you're just an individual doing this on your own on YouTube or something, you might have it might be a little harder for you to make this argument. But from the libraries, because we have other purposes and we've established that, it may be a little easier for us to do that. One question I had a month ago when I did this talk with another group of library folks, someone was because they had so many kids and they were, being socially distanced, they had to separate the kids. So they had one group off to the side and they were scanning the picture books and showing them on a TV screen. And they were asking about that. So during this time, that was probably okay. Now they were also filming it. So the full picture was being filmed. And I was like, so that's why I brought up the whole, are you doing the whole picture on the screen that's being recorded? Are you doing that? Is that coming up? If you, instead of scanning it, had an Elmo device, which is, for those of you who are not familiar with an Elmo, remember those old overhead projectors that you could project a page on? That's what an Elmo does. It lets you project a book. If you're doing that just in a storytime setting because you're being socially distanced apart, that's your copy of the book. Remember first sale doctrine? That's your copy of the book. So you can display that copy. You're not scanning it, so you're not making a copy. You're just projecting the book itself. It's not getting saved anywhere. So when that machine gets turned off, the copy's gone. It's not affixed. Remember, it has to take, copyright involves a tangible expression. Because it's not fixed, it's not tangible. It will disappear unless if you're scanning and saving it, then it's fixed. But just using an Elmo to project it, it's not fixed. And so there are those where I've read who say, well, that's totally in fair use because it's not fair use, it's first sale doctrine because it's your copy. And you're not making a copy of the copy, you're just projecting the copy you own. It's a little like who's on first, what's on second, the old Abbott and Costello thing sometimes, right? It gets tricky in that language. But those are the things you think about. So when you're wondering about copyright and fair use and does something apply with fair use, it's always situation based. It's not a hard and fast rule. And Denise, you mentioned that roadmap. The American Library Association has a fair use checklist that you can Google, and it's just a checklist sheet where you can say, is this? Check. Is it that? Check. So it helps you kind of decide and think about it. And if someone complains, can help you maybe communicate how it fits within fair use on there. So it's just a one-page checklist of the 4 factors and questions you should ask within each one.
And yes, I wrote a note about that because, and I know you're not an attorney, and I have started many a conversation on copyright and other topics with that. I am not an attorney, but
Yeah.
Sometimes I think intent So if you go through that fair use guideline before you do something and make notes on it and write on the top of it what you're talking about, and then something happens, at least you have in hand something that shows what your intent was or what your thoughts were at the time, and that could help, I feel like.
Yeah.
I don't know that it'll save anybody from anything, but it
Yeah. But yeah, may not save, but it could help. If you're, I don't know how you're sharing these, but in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, there is a piece of it, and darn it, I can't remember what it's called, but basically there's a section of it where it refers to places like YouTube and Facebook. And it says that they're not liable if you post something that is a violation of copyright. So if someone who uses Facebook or someone who uses YouTube posts something that's a violation, YouTube and Facebook aren't liable if, when they get a complaint, they take it down. So they take it down, they notify the person who has posted it. And that post person then has, like, I don't know, 2 weeks maybe, to say why they think it's okay. So if you've done all that thinking out and someone comes back and says, Facebook says, no, you can't have this here, or wherever you posted it says you can't have that there, you've already got your stuff written out. This is fair use because it meets this, meets that, meets this, and meets that, and then you can submit it to Facebook or YouTube or wherever you've got it.
and it shows you're being thoughtful and you're aware of copyright. I mean, ignorance is never a defense or an answer to a question. You can't say, well, I didn't know about that. That
Right.
doesn't, that's not useful.
And courts have, when there's a big lawsuit against the University of Georgia for their reserves stuff, and the judge did look at their policy. Well, you had a policy there. There was an intention for it. Now because of the court case, they have reworked that policy because the judge did find some things that weren't square, but it did say, you know what? You had a policy in place to try to deal with this, rather than you were just like the Wild West here of, just doing willy-nilly, copying everything. So yeah, I think it can be helpful to you to have this thought process and notes that as you understood it, this was fair use, and it can help you explain it to someone else. If someone in your community is saying, oh, is it okay for us to do this? It can help you explain.
I put the links on there for that index, and also for the fair use checklist.
I saw that.
ALA's got a good, their whole copyright tools is very good for everyone to be able to use.
Yes. Yeah. Very useful. And I think, the stuff from Carrie Russell that I mentioned earlier is on their programming librarian website program. And so that's where you can get a lot of that information from there as well. Yeah. I go to those places a lot. Those are my go-tos. Yeah. Okay, a few other things when libraries are doing things. When can we copy an item for a patron? There are times we get an email from someone saying, I live 2 states away, and I was wondering if you could copy this thing that you have and send it to me. Or can you legally do that? Like, oh, I want just this chapter of the book. You probably can't do the whole thing, right? But you can do like a chapter or something of it, if it's for the patron's personal use, just their personal use. They're not going to do it for anything big, professional, or it's just for their own individual research, personal use. You have to have the copyright notice stamped on there clearly, or a warning saying, hey, your use of this might fall under copyright. So be careful with what you do with it. So that's within the law that lets us do some things there. It's also if we have items that we want to preserve in our libraries. And this is something that libraries can do that other organizations cannot do. For purposes of preservation or research, we can make 3 copies under these criteria here that are listed. Last 20 years of copyright, which I don't know, how long does copyright? It's long.
Yeah, does it have something to do with a certain number of years after the author's
death? Yeah, nice happy thing. 70 years after the author's death.
Wow.
It's a corporate work, corporately created work, corporation like a film, it's 90 years from the first publication of it. So it has to be within the last 20 years of that copyright length. So that last 70 years. So it's got to be pretty old. It's something that is not distributed commercially anymore or is not available at a reasonable price. Don't ask me what a reasonable price is. That varies. That's not stipulated. You have to be open to the public. And so that's what gets a lot of archives. There's some archives who try to do it. They're like, no, you're not open to the public. You're just like hidden behind this museum or whatever. You have to have the copyright notice on it. Again, only 3 copies. So 1 copy to preserve, 1 copy to use, 1 copy to back up the one you're going to use. And the copy cannot leave the premises. So those 3 copies can't be something you share with somebody else. It has to stay within your library because it's for your preservation of it for your patrons' use. What about our patrons copying things? Right? Some of us have scanners, photocopiers. Are we liable if they do copy stuff?
Now, this is something that I've, over the years of working in public libraries, they will place the copyright notice, tape it to the top of the photocopy machine, the lid, when they used to have lids. They don't anymore. Now they have the thing that it slides down in, but copied and pasted within prominent view of where the copy machine
Right.
is.
And that's in the law.
It is? Okay.
It's in the actual copyright law that if you do this, you are not liable. That's why you see it on all these libraries all over the place, right? And she's like, we have it on the printer scanner in the chat, right? You have that there. It's in the Copyright Act law there that if you do this, it's on the patron doing the copying, not the library who's providing the tool for doing it. But that's not the only way our patrons make copies anymore, is it? What about with their phones or their iPads? Or maybe they brought in their own portable scanner. Yeah, phones. What about those? Yeah, it's like, oh, I don't know. It's not specifically addressed, like, because they didn't have phones back then when the copyright law was written. It was the most recent big implementation of this was 1976. So this thought that there would be something other than a photocopier would probably blow their minds. There have been some libraries. This is an example from Walpole University Library, have started also having this sign up. Like this, that if you're making it, again, it's on you. It's just similar to the statement on the printer or the scanner. I don't know, some libraries also check out iPads. So if you have an iPad that has a camera, patron could be using that for that device or that purpose. So if you, again, have a note, some libraries have started doing a statement for mobile devices as well. Always something, huh? Always something. So I just wanted to highlight those things because we spent a lot of time talking about what you can't do with copyright, but there's some things you can do, and there are things that just, as a library we can do, and ways we can make sure to protect ourselves. And those statements are simple things to do. Any other questions or comments, or observations? Stop share so I can see everybody.
This is a topic that I enjoy listening to on a regular basis and hearing about it, right? Because you kind of forget, and again, it's important. It is important, and we get so accustomed to just doing things, just saying, oh yeah, the copier's over there, kind of thing, that we don't. I didn't even think about the phones, I got to tell you, but I don't.
I didn't either till about a year ago. Yeah.
My children and grandchildren are remind me regularly, because my daughter will call and ask for a recipe, and I'll say, well, I could email it to you. And she says, Mom, take a picture with your phone and text it to me. It doesn't even occur to me. And I'm thinking, how can you read that on your phone? She says, I can make it bigger. so
Right.
so
So
like
that's what
I
a
say,
lot of people do.
it just does not even occur to me.
So there's
yeah.
always different permutations to it, so you want to think about. And you're right, it's something that requires you to think about often. So I personally, I follow, I geek out on the news alerts. So I have copyright or fair use set up as a news alert, because the same questions apply every single time. It's always those 4 fair use factors. They're always looking at those 4 things. And so seeing how the courts interpret those helps you understand what you can and can't do. Because if you read the law itself, it's really vague. It's gray. And the only time we have specifics is when the courts have ruled on things. Like the picture of Naruto earlier. We don't really know what happened with that because they settled out of court. So right now that image is in the public domain as a part of that settlement, but which is why I could make it so big, all that. It was in the public domain. And it changes, but those 4 questions, those 4 factors are the same thing every single time. And so just reading the news and seeing how the courts are interpreting those factors is just what will keep your head in it. At least I find it does.
Well, and we've talked about on several occasions, our group gets together on a fairly almost weekly basis nowadays. It's just something that developed over the last year.
Mm-hmm.
And we have discussed this story time thing, and what are we going to do now, because now, and how library services have changed, particularly public library services, because people have gotten accustomed to bring it out to my car and put it in the trunk. There's all kinds of things people got used to through all of this.
Yeah.
And have to decide what services we're going to keep, what we're going to improve upon, how, are we going to go back? And story time is one of those that comes up on a fairly regular basis, because there are people who are so busy in their lives that they were skipping story time and not bringing their children because they just didn't have time. They felt like they didn't have time, and it wasn't a priority for them. So we were actually able to reach children and do the educational factors, and in the parents' eye view, do the entertainment piece. But now what are we going to do? And that it was kind of a panic almost feeling of, okay, they're going to shut us down on June 30th. Now what? But this gives you some thought. If you only show an occasional picture and describe the rest of them and add vocabulary and add repeat and movements and sing and songs,
Yeah. Now be careful with the songs, because this is
yeah.
also protected by copyright.
True. I hadn't thought of that. Maybe some of the finger rhymes, at least in the public domain,
Right.
that's what you have to look for, is what's in the public domain and what
Mhm.
you can use to add in and hold up. If it's a book about colors, you could just hold up a blank construction paper and say, here's the red, and it's, what do you know that's red, and entertain that way, and add a few of the pictures from the book in, record it, use it, and then take it down. Don't leave it forever.
Right.
And that seems to me, you're intentionally transforming it, and you're intentionally limiting it, so it's still going to allow you to do an online story time.
Well, and your purpose is also intentional, that it's more than just, entertainment, that parents just sitting them down watching something. It's more than that. You're adding a lot of educational elements to that to make it's not entertainment. You're doing that to teach kids about narratives and stories. You're teaching concepts, colors, opposites, up, down. You're teaching those things.
Numbers, the whole thing.
It's exactly. And as well as reading motivation. And, I even think with those questions, you're teaching critical thinking. Like, what do you think, with those predictable books, what do you think is going to happen next?
Right.
That's teaching critical thinking too. So you're teaching a lot of skills in that story time. You're not doing it for entertainment purposes.
And then I think the key will be that I think that for the publishers' peace of mind, is that you are going to limit it and take it down. You just won't leave it forever.
Right.
So
I think that would be very helpful, because you also have to think about your environment and how comfortable you feel doing that. And like, you never want to be the reason a lawyer contacts your organization, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, you don't want to be handcuffed by something, because this is for the good of your community. Right. This is for the greater society. There's a societal good here. So
that is a lot to think about, but I so appreciate you coming on and giving us a good explanation of.
Well, you're welcome. I hope so.
A really complex topic. I mean, and that helps a lot. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.